And then something that's very important, in vitro non veritas is what I'm saying. I'll explain that when we get to it and its relevance. Understanding the critical value of echinacea root. Now, I'm sure many of you will be wondering, are you going to hear anything new today? Some of you might be confused about how best to use herbs. And this is exemplified no greater than in the case of echinacea. The confusion that already exists about this extremely important herb for the immune system has now gone up another notch with concerns about cytokine storm and things like that. So let's try to have a really good, solid, sound, rational understanding of the critical value of echinacea root. And you might find at the end of this presentation, even though on the face of it, the subject material is already known to you, that you have at least a new confidence about how best to use immune herbs like echinacea root. Other key immune herbs will also be briefly discussed, and it's not a comprehensive list. I'll also, again, briefly touch on immune herbs and cytokine storm risk. And here I'll be drawing on a much more extensive, more than 3,000 word paper I have written on this topic, and I will refer you to that as well for more information. If we want to use antiviral herbs, it's important that we use ones that are clinically relevant, not ones that are just speculated about, especially on the basis of test tube research. And perhaps you're beginning to understand why I have this section in vitro non veritas. And then finally, let's look at some core basic protocols of supporting immunity and resisting challenges to our respiratory health. So let's start by looking at how our immune system works. We have two sides to our immune system. We also have barrier function, and barrier function is hugely important. But when we actually get to the functioning of immune cells themselves, it's largely divided into two main functions: your innate immunity and your adaptive immunity. So if you look at your innate immunity, it's responsible for our immediate response to a pathogen, and it occurs generally within hours. And in order for our innate immune system to recognize a pathogen, it has inbuilt a range of specialized receptors. And we're discovering more of these receptors all the time. They're known as pattern recognition receptors, or PRRs. And then once a pattern recognition receptor is activated, various defense molecules like interferons, defensins, and so on are released to help the body mount the fight against that pathogen, and some key innate immune cells are activated. So the key cells that are activated in our innate response are our macrophages, our neutrophils, and our natural killer cells. And what they can do is they can engulf, they're the Pac-Men of the immune system. They can engulf pathogenic material and destroy it. The natural killer cells don't engulf, but they do a concerted attack against pathogenic material. And generally, the natural killer cells will be attacking cells, but maybe cells that are infected, whereas the macrophages and neutrophils are often gobbling up the actual infectious agent. So a little bit more about pattern recognition receptors. They recognize molecular components of microorganisms that are not found on the host, and these are described as PAMs, pathogen-associated molecular patterns. And the pattern recognition receptors can either be on the membrane of the immune cell or inside the cell. And those ones that are inside the cell are particularly adapted, for example, at detecting a virus or some bacteria that infect inside cells, because no point having them on the surface of this cell if the virus is already inside. The most common class of PIRs are the toll-like receptors, TLR, and they come from the German word toll, meaning wonderful. And they were first discovered in fruit flies and called toll receptors. And when they found them also in humans, they said, oh, they're toll-like. So I guess the fruit flies got in first. So we resemble the fruit flies having toll-like receptors. Each one of them is tuned to recognize a distinct molecular pattern. And there's about 11 of them. But there are many other pattern recognition receptors as well. And those distinct molecular patterns can be either for bacterial infection, fungal, viral, or protozoal. Now, the macrophages and the dendritic cells, which are another type of engulfing phagocytic cell, don't just destroy the pathogenic material, they also process it. And they process it via the adaptive immune pathways. So adaptive immunity is based on the special properties of the T and B lymphocytes, which can respond selectively and very specifically to different antigens or non-self material that are on the pathogens. And this leads to, as well as a targeted response, because those T and B lymphocytes undergo multiplication, it also means you have a stronger response and a permanent memory is established, and hence it's adaptive immunity because you have an adaptation to that pathogen. So what happens is that the macrophages and the dendritic cells present antigen to the helper T cell. And via signal 1, they recognize it's foreign. And via signal 2, they recognize that this foreign material is actually a threat. And that then initiates your adaptive immune response. So I'd like to summarize all this now diagrammatically. And there are many diagrams of how the immune system works as a whole, but this diagram is a really good one because I think it summarizes things accurately and vividly and distinctly. So we start off with the pathogen. And as you can see, the pathogen then interacts with a pattern recognition receptor. In this case, the example is a toll-like receptor on the dendritic cell. And the dendritic cell then initiates a number of processes. So if it's a virus, you will then get the release of interferons that will help the body directly attack the virus. You will also get inflammatory reaction via the release of a range of inflammatory cytokines. But in addition, the dendritic cells will also release similar and often overlapping cytokines to the T cell, and that will act as a signal to the confirmation to the T cell, to the helper T cell, that this pathogen is indeed a threat. And then you will either get a Th1 response or a Th2 response, and there are others like Th17 that have been recognized. It's important here to emphasize that there's actually two roles of the cytokines. One is their higher release as pro-inflammatory mediators up the top there, but also the cytokines are involved, as you can see, in immune signaling, especially signal 2. Hence, if, for example, in a test tube, a herbal agent is shown to improve cytokine responses, it doesn't necessarily mean that that herbal agent is going to drive inflammation. What it probably more likely means is that it's going to improve communication between the dendritic cell and the helper T cell and help the body to more efficiently mount an adaptive immune response. So let's look at this issue of in vitro non veritas. It's a play on words. It was Latin words, obviously, and it was I was writing an article for a journal once, and was talking about how some test tube research on black cohosh that it might, increase the risk of certain adverse effects was bogus, was wrong, because it was based on test tube research. And we have all this human information, clinical and observational information, that black cohosh is completely safe in people. And the editor came back to me and he headed my article, In Vitro Non Veritas. And I thought, oh, he's obviously a Latin scholar. And yes, he's nailed it. So it means you can't necessarily get truth from test tube research. And if I look at the herbal field and the statements being made about this, that, and the other, and we'll see examples of that today, I would have to say this is the biggest trap of all in interpreting herbal data. And I've seen experienced clinicians, herbalists, herbal experts, and very good scientists all fall into this same trap when it comes to herbs. We're also seeing it in the news these days that something might test positive for antiviral activity, for example, in a test tube, and everyone's onto it. Hey, it's some hallelujah moment. Well, no, because it's test tube research. So let's have a look at test tube research as it specifically applies to herbs. So as we know, herbs are mixtures of chemicals, and for the purpose of the example, I've said 15 key phytochemicals or plant chemicals. And this is a whole plant extract being experimented in a laboratory study. And then it's mixed, for example, typically with isolated cells, and you get a range of effects. Or it might be mixed with some viruses and you get a range of effects, or some viral infected cells and you get a range of effects. And you interpret from those effects. But the important point here is that exposure levels are often unrealistic. And the second important point, in other words, you'll never achieve those levels in tissue, in target tissue, which is represented by those cells. But the other important point is that herbal phytochemicals have varying bioavailability. So what actually happens in reality, for example, when you take an oral dose, is that 5 of those 15 phytochemicals, yes, they will get absorbed, but another 5 will get changed. They might get changed by your gastric acid. They will particularly be changed by your gut flora. And yet another 5 of those 15 won't be absorbed. And for this and other reasons that I've touched on and will touch on, extrapolation of in vitro research on herbs needs to be done with great caution. For example, I'm seeing that a particular herb is being described as antiviral because it contains large compounds known as lectins. And the lectins, yes, they can kill viruses. But the point is that the lectins have zero bioavailability as such. And so you're not going to get effects, for example, in the lungs or other target tissues because the lectins won't get anywhere near there. They'll remain in the gut. So the lectins might have an antiviral activity in the gut, but nowhere else. And we're now seeing an abundance of these misinformed extrapolations, and they relate particularly also to concerns about, for example, cytokine storm. The reality is you can do the same research on tea. A cup of tea in vitro has potent antiviral activity. So we're all suggesting that tea is the answer for every viral infection you might encounter? No, because we know that's nonsense, because everyone's drinking tea and they're still getting sick. So we can somewhat overcome this bioavailability issue by looking at studies on single phytochemicals with known bioavailability, and I'll give an example of that with echinacea. But even then, there's still questions of bioavailability to the target tissue, but some, as I said, we can possibly answer that. the active entity, because even though something might be bioavailable, it might get conjugated by the liver and change slightly. And this is relevant when we discuss the antiviral activity of it, for example, of licorice later on. And does it still get access to the tissue? Like respiratory tissue is quite difficult to access. And does it get access to a particular target on that tissue? And how relevant is the test tube model being used? So given the chemical complexity of herbs, the uncertain bioavailability of many phytochemicals, and the fact that most herbs are already approved for use in people, the best model for understanding how herbs work for phytopharmacological research is not the little rat in the teacup there, but the 6-foot rat. So please don't get upset about test tube research that might show harm or potential harm. And above all, don't make clinical choices on test tube research. Let's now move on and talk about a number of key immune herbs. And here I want to emphasize first something really important about the herbal approach to infection. And it's misunderstood from what I've learned and seen among practitioners of a range of clinical experience, from the novices to the experts. Firstly, let me say it's now clear that we are approaching a crisis point with infection control. And so it's very important that we understand what we can offer with herbs in terms of infection control. What is the key herbal action when treating or preventing any type of infection? It is immune enhancement. Anything else, antimicrobial, antiviral, antibacterial, is secondary. And if you give herbs that you might think might attack viruses and you're not doing immune support and enhancement at the same time, it will be relatively useless. I used to see this often when I was teaching undergraduate at a naturopathic college. I'd, for example, in the exam, put a question about, what would be the best herbs for, let's say, cystitis? And the students would come back with, and they talk about, buku and uva ursi and things like that, or corn silk and couch grass, which is soothing and so on. But more often than not, the students would leave out immune enhancement. Is the first thing that you must do, and it is probably the most important thing to do. It's our frontline treatment, and it's fundamental to infection control and treatment. What are the key immune herbs as I see it? And as I've said, this list is not comprehensive. We can include herbs, for example, like the Ayurvedic herb Tinospora. Most adaptogen tonic herbs have immune activity. There is also the medicinal mushrooms. So this list is not comprehensive, but I've included here things that I think are quite useful to focus on. And the major immune herbs, as I see it, and it's based on clinical evidence and traditional clinical evidence, are echinacea and andrographis. And then holy basil and the adaptogenic tonic herbs, but especially astragalus, are also very important and useful. And each has a different context or emphasis for use. So let's begin. It's always a pleasure for me to talk about echinacea because it's my favorite herb. It has so much to offer the modern herbal clinician, but it is so confused and misunderstood. And I was even seeing this today in communication with, a highly regarded herbalist, and he was reflecting research to me, test tube research, that echinacea is has some antiviral activity. To me, that research is of little relevance. Echinacea has antiviral activity because it boosts immune function. That's how it might have antiviral activity. Of its own, I don't think it has antiviral activity. So what they're finding in test tubes, as I said, you could just get the same with a cup of tea and find the same activity. It's not really the reason. Mind you, I will say that a black tea gargle does have significant antiviral activity topically. So a lot of this test tube research only applies for topical use. And what we see with echinacea is there's a multiple of products using different species, plant parts, manufacturing methods, and it just leads to incredible confusion. And that reflects on the confusion over what phytochemicals in echinacea are responsible for its immune activity. Oh, it's all due to the polysaccharides. Oh, we have to actually make echinacea extracts that don't have any alkylamides in it because they're not what's important. It's the polysaccharides. To me, none of this holds water. We only have a basic understanding, and this is probably part of the issue for the confusion, of its exact action on the immune system. But we do have a number of intriguing recent developments, ones which the research team I'm associated with have actually been involved in uncovering. And as well, there are many myths about how it should and should not be used. I call them the echinacea rules and regulations. And we're now finding another one coming through, you can't use it if there's a risk of cytokine storm. Yet another barrier that's put in front of what should be the widespread use of one of the most useful and benign herbs when it comes to supporting immune function. So let's just briefly recap. Where did we learn about echinacea? Well, we first learned about it from Native American tribes, and then their use of echinacea was adopted by the eclectic physicians. They were a very important group of, I guess you could call them alternative practitioners in the United States from the mid-19th to early 20th century. And they used other things, but herbs were a big part of what they used. And by 1921, echinacea, and specifically it was the root of Echinacea angustifolia, and the traditional use of echinacea was the root, was by far the most popular treatment prescribed by the eclectic physicians. And we can see here this represented on this graph. This is for data for 1920, but it was released by the Lloyd brothers in 1921. And you can see that big line there that I've highlighted is sales of echinacea. And you see it completely dwarfs the next best-selling herb, which interestingly is fringe tree, and then it's macrotis, which is the old name for black cohosh. So you see, far and away, echinacea outsold all other herbs among the eclectics by the 1920s. And there are some beautiful monographs on echinacea in the eclectic textbooks. And the two key ones are Felter and Lloyd, King's American Dispensatory, and Allingwood and Lloyd's American Materia Medica. And I would recommend to anyone who wants to get a better grasp of echinacea and how it can be used clinically and what its value is and what its potential is, to read the monographs on echinacea. These are available online. Both these books, you can download them. Have a look at the echinacea monographs. It will open your eyes up. It certainly did with me. It was these monographs that led me onto this 30-plus year journey that I've had with this important herb. And that 30-plus year journey, during that, and based on the eclectic writings, I was maintaining that we have to use echinacea root, that as the eclectics noted, it must be high in those tingling components the alkyl amides, and that narrows you down to angustifolia and purpurea as species for choosing the route. Because the eclectics noted if it was good quality, you get that strong tingling sensation. And it also made me understand dose, that the eclectics in acute situations were not afraid to give massive doses, at least in the short term. So all of these things I learned from the eclectics, but I learned another thing that just somehow evolved in my clinical experience with echinacea, and it was, of course, the #1 herb that I was using. And that was that it has a significant role, and probably the primary use of the herb is in fact prevention. So a lot of these issues had no proof when I started using them, applying them clinically, but I will briefly demonstrate that they all have proof now. And if you want to see this fully explored, then I suggest you read the monograph in Principles and Practice of Phytotherapy, 2nd edition, on echinacea root, which I wrote. So a part of the research that I was involved in was doing a pharmacokinetic study on echinacea root to understand what it is that might make it work, because we know the limitations of test tube research, in vitro non veritas. So this was a study in 11 healthy individuals, and blood samples were taken over 12 hours, and they took 4 echinacea root tablets as a single dose. So what did we find? What was in their bloodstream? And these things I'm listed are touted as potential active components of echinacea. The caffeic acid components, no, none of those were found in the bloodstream. And none of their degradation products, even from, for example, gut flora, were found in the bloodstream. The alkylamides, the tingling components, we didn't find their degradation products as well. And the polysaccharides, which are used to justify the use of the aerial parts of echinacea, again, we found none of those in the bloodstream. The only compounds we could identify in the human plasma after oral doses of echinacea root were the alkylamides, and they were there in approximately the same ratio as what was in the initial product. So I would say if you want to model echinacea root and what it does in test tube research, then obviously you need to model the alkylamides. So what do they do in such experiments? Well, the fascinating thing is they strongly bind to cannabinoid receptors. They are phytocannabinoids, causing very subtle and complex modulation of immune function. And interestingly, part of that is they exert not pro-inflammatory effects by driving pro-inflammatory cytokines, but anti-inflammatory effects. There's other research that's in my monograph that shows that they probably enhance the preparedness of immune cells for that cytokine signaling, between the dendritic cell and the helper T cell. They also inhibit the breakdown of your own endocannabinoids, extending their effects in your body. They possibly upregulate dendritic cell maturation. Again, all speaking to the innate side of immune function. As mentioned, they potentially prime innate immune responses, and they support natural killer cell numbers in terms of both their activity and viability. This last point is based on in vivo research on mice. This experiment showed that echinacea actually reversed the aging of innate immunity. It was done by Sandra Miller and team. So we know that in particular our innate immune function declines as we age. And this is especially reflected in the natural killer cells that decline in number and function. And it's thought to be a factor behind the increase of various disease risks with age. Experiments in healthy elderly mice found that 2 weeks of oral dose of echinacea root extract returned their natural killer cell numbers and functions to the level in young adults. So it literally had a rejuvenating effect on our innate immunity. And this is extremely important because we're finding that obviously as people age, they have less resistance to infections, and especially viral infections. And that's because of this aging of their innate immunity. So with echinacea, with its regular use, because this took 2 weeks to kick in, with its regular use, we can rejuvenate their innate immune function. And in addition, showing echinacea was perfectly safe and doesn't wear out your immune system, and I'll talk more about that soon. And mice fed echinacea for most of their lives actually lived longer. In fact, the impact on lifespan was higher than most of the touted anti-aging remedies. So if we want to look at an anti-aging herb, the animal data for supports echinacea strongly ahead of others. So what about the clinical evidence for echinacea? Now, there was a Cochrane study that was published in 2014. And the Cochrane noted this conundrum that we have with echinacea, that most consumers and even physicians and clinicians are not aware that the products are available under the banner echinacea differ appreciably in their composition. And it does confound, systematic review and meta-analysis because of this variability. Nonetheless, they went ahead and attempted to do that kind of analysis of the evidence. They certainly, they particularly were just looking at the common cold and assessing whether it was, echinacea was safe and effective for both prevention and treatment. So when it comes to treatment, of 7 trials on cold duration, only 1 showed a benefit from echinacea versus placebo. So in terms of the common cold, taking echinacea after the fact, which is the most common understanding of how to use it, the evidence wasn't very strong. Most prevention trials were inconclusive, but when they did a post hoc pooling of the results, a kind of meta-analysis, it suggested a relative risk reduction of 10 to 20%. Now, I'll illustrate why that is the case on this slide. So here you see a forest plot, which is a standard tool you use in meta-analysis. So that line you can see going down is the no effect line. And in order for a treatment to be conclusively beneficial or conclusively adverse, it must clear the no effect lines in terms of its error bars as well. And you see none of the error bars clear the no effect line. They cross it. The study we conducted, or we sponsored, which was on infection rates in air travellers, was on the line for the primary outcome. So P equaled 0.05. It wasn't less than 0.05. But for other measures like respiratory symptom score and what have you, it was clear of the line. So we did show a preventative effect in air travellers of subsequent development of respiratory infection. And you see that's helped weight the evidence. But have a look at that no effect line and look at the little vertical blips on the horizontal lines there for each trial. And you see none of the trials, not one, is over the other side of having an adverse effect or increased rate of infection. They're all to the left, aren't they? And that's why when you pull that data, you actually show that echinacea probably significantly does reduce the risk of getting infection, viral infection, respiratory infection, in this case common cold, when taken preventatively, which was how I began to use echinacea clinically a couple of decades ago. And it's been taken even further by this group who did a meta-analysis. And in that meta-analysis, they showed that the use of echinacea extracts was associated with a reduced risk of respiratory infections. The relative risk factor was 0.649. That means 35% reduction of risk. Ethanolic extracts of echinacea appeared to be superior over pressed juices. So again, you're stressing the alkylamide aspect. And increased doses during acute episodes further enhance these effects. This all reflects the eclectic clinical practice, apart from the preventative side, which was something that was developed from my clinical experience. And just to highlight another point, as an aside, this study was looking at the topical use of echinacea alkylamides for atopic eczema, for atopic dermatitis. And they found that it was effective due to interaction with cannabinoid 2 receptors, which is what the alkylamides interact with, not cannabinoid 1 receptors, and that it was exerting anti-inflammatory effects. So I want to emphasize here that for total cytokine production, echinacea is probably anti-inflammatory, but that doesn't mean to say it doesn't prime innate immune cells to enhance their cytokine signaling. That's a completely different phenomenon. I like to, and sorry, this was highlighted in the words that I've put a ring around, that not surprisingly, based on in vitro results, the well-tolerated echinacea root extract-based cream reduced the atopic dermatitis scores significantly compared to baseline and also a natural control. I'd like to now look at this myth that's out there that will not go away, that echinacea can only be used short term, because that cuts right across its preventative use, doesn't it? Because if you're going to use something preventatively, especially these days, you want to be taking it long term. I believe, I've done some forensic digging, and I believe the misunderstanding, and indeed certainly people have cited this in their rationale, the misunderstanding for this myth was based on a German study. And it was looking at an innate aspect of the innate immune response. In humans, it was oral doses given to humans of a echinacea root preparation, Echinacea purpurea. And you can see the dark blue line is the controls, which shows no effect on phagocytic activity, which was the aspect of the innate immune response measured, versus the pale blue line. And you see when echinacea was dosed, the pale blue line goes up, and there's up to 120% increase in phagocytic activity. But oh my goodness, after 5 days, suddenly the line starts to dip steeply. And this scientific paper was in German. So someone reading the paper with perhaps not good translation or not getting into the detail will look at that figure and say, there you have it, after 5 days, the effect of echinacea starts to wear off. But have a look at those arrows down the bottom. Those arrows were the dosage days on which echinacea was given. It was only dosed for 5 days. It was then stopped by day 6. So the decline you're seeing with day 6 is a standard treatment washout effect. And look, by day 6, your phagocytic activity is still 60% above baseline. So rather than wearing out the immune system and causing it to go into decline in this model, in this trial, it actually showed that it had a residual effect of immune upregulation. And this is an important point, because they're now talking about this concept of trained innate immunity. And that is, we know that the adaptive immune system has a memory, and hence it adapts and gets trained, and you get your memory T cells and what have you. But they thought because it was just receptor-based with the pattern recognition receptors, that the innate immunity couldn't be trained. But now they're realizing via epigenetic mechanisms it can be. And I think that many of our herbs, and including echinacea root, actually train the innate immune system and make it more responsive. And guess what? They're investigating certain vaccines like BCG in exactly that regard, because they train the innate immunity. Well, you can only have them intermittently and the effect wears off. You can take echinacea every day and train your innate immunity every day. Another important immune herb is andrographis, and you can see from this table that there are several clinical trials showing the benefit of andrographis, mainly given after the fact, after the infection, a few for the common cold, one for tonsillitis. There's also one prevention trial that showed a significant decrease in incidence in children. So andrographis can be used preventatively. Now, this data was analysed in 2 systematic reviews and meta-analyses. And in one review, they actually found more trials than those 5, 7 double-blind controlled trials, and the methodological quality of the trials was judged as reasonable, although the JADAD scale is not tended to use these days. This was, as you can see, 16 years ago. And the data suggested that andrographis was superior to placebo in alleviating the subjective symptoms of uncomplicated upper respiratory tract infection, and also from that one trial I mentioned, preliminary evidence of a preventative effect. And then in a second review, which only selected 3 trials, which it deemed were of much better quality, and put them in a meta-analysis, found that andrographis, either alone or in combination with an adaptogenic herb, Eleutherococcus, was more effective than placebo in the treatment of uncomplicated upper respiratory tract infection. Now, the point used here is that the doses need to be adequate, and they were typically up to 1,000 milligram of extract, which corresponds to 6 grams of starting herbal material, so they're reasonably high doses, and especially delivering 50 to 60 milligrams a day of the andrographolides. Holy basil is another important immune herb, but because of the evidence is probably not one of the key ones. The 2 key ones, as I said, are echinacea and andrographis, but holy basil. There was a small trial that showed a reduction in infection in children over a 6-month period, so a preventative effect. There's also been a study in healthy volunteers that showed that it increased aspects of innate immune responses, interferons, helper T cells, natural killer cells. So significant in that regard, because it's a human study, it's not test tube research. And the daily dose used in that second study was 2 grams of dried leaf for 4 weeks. Astragalus is also important for immunity, and being one of those key tonic adaptogenic herbs that are great for immune function, it's the key one, I would suspect. It's best for people who have some sort of immune depletion and might also be energy depleted and stressed. The other point about astragalus is that certainly in traditional Chinese medicine, it's largely not used in acute infection. Its role is largely preventative. And for Western herbalists, I recommend, because we don't understand the complexities of the Chinese system, it's best used preventatively. And there was one study that showed that people with low white cell count, and that's one of my particular uses of astragalus, or in conjunction with Thania somnifera or ashwagandha. I use that to help with low white cell count. And they received either a high dose or a low dose of astragalus over 8 weeks, and there was a significant rise in white blood cell count in both groups, but with a higher rise for the high dose group, as you might expect. And highlighting the important role of astragalus in disease infection prevention, recent experience in China where they looked at formulas that were being applied in the community to help prevent respiratory infections, that astragalus and licorice were the two herbs most commonly included in those formulations. So preventative, astragalus preventative, especially in people who might have some sort of compromise of their immune response. I'd like to now move on and just briefly look at this concept of immune herbs increasing the risk of cytokine storm. Now, as I mentioned, I have written a 3,600 word discussion of this topic, and that should be available if you would inquire from the person who connected you to this webinar in one way or another. That should be available for you. I'm trying to put it out there in as many ways as possible. Obviously, at the moment, it's a delicate topic, and so we're careful about how we're sharing that information. So here I'm just merely summarizing the findings, and the full discussion is in that paper. So there are concerns that have been raised that certain herbs and its echinacea, medicinal mushrooms, astragalus, elderberry in particular, because in test tube research they've been shown to enhance cytokine responses, that they might also then deleteriously enhance the cytokine response during acute respiratory infection, viral infection, and hence increase the risk of cytokine storm. Now, these concerns are based solely on a one-dimensional analysis of in vitro studies. And I've already discussed in vitro non veritas. And they're not supported by a detailed analysis of the published scientific and traditional literature. And as I mentioned earlier, those interpretations don't differentiate between the initial role of cytokines during an infection as immune signaling agents versus their later role in promoting inflammation of sepsis. So cytokine storm equals sepsis. What in the old days they called sepsis, we now call cytokine storm because we understand it mechanistically. It's interesting that Allingwood, in his monograph, in his book, he regarded echinacea root as the herb for sepsis, which is cytokine storm. Since the main roles of echinacea root, astragalus, and medicinal mushrooms are for prevention, although especially echinacea and medicinal mushrooms, you can also use them during infection, the argument behind concerns over the use, it becomes even weaker. Okay, if you have a concern, if I haven't convinced you after you read my paper, we'll just use them for prevention. I mean, it's very weak extrapolation to suggest that they're going to have a role in enhancing cytokine storm risk later in infection, but I believe they're safe across the board. What is cytokine storm? It's a chaotic, intense, and unregulated response to massive tissue destruction that is occurring via necrosis, and the necrotic dying of these cells, like respiratory cells, sends a powerful danger signal to the immune system that upregulates an inappropriate innate immune response and hence overproduction of cytokines. And it's unlikely to be capable of a further augmentation by any agent, much less a relatively benign medicinal plant. So in fact, immune herbs will support a focused initial immune response including enhanced cytokine signaling, and thereby reduce the risk of any infection progressing to this stage 3 or late stage development of an infection that is characterized by cytokine storm. We're now going to look at what I consider to be clinically relevant antiviral herbs. And please keep in mind, in vitro non veritas when it comes to many other suggestions, the abundant suggestions that are out there about herbs that might have antiviral activity. Artemisia annua, no, not because it's an antimalarial, but because it contains artemisinin-related compounds that are shown to have antiviral activity. It's the artemisinin is found in the upper leaves in these glandular trichomes, and it also contains flavonoids and essential oils. So I'm not in favour of using pure artemisinin. The whole herb extract containing artemisinin is what I recommend. And buyer beware, because our labs have tested many products with Artemisia annua on the label, and they contain no artemisinin at all in many cases. So, as I was emphasising, the artemisinins is not just malaria, and you see they have antiviral activity. Why is that? Well, look at the chemical structure of artemisinin. It contains what's called a peroxide bridge. That's it there. And it gives that compound significant destructive activity. And that destructive activity can help destroy viruses as well as malaria parasites. It's not stable in liquid form because that's a very delicate structure that's prone to splitting. That peroxide bridge can split. So we have to use Artemisia annua products if we want effects from artemisinin in solid dose forms, only tablets, capsules, and so on. The antiviral effects have been described in a number of studies. This is just some summary. And yes, admittedly, it's in vitro research, but we know that artemisinin does have bioavailability, at least up to about 6 or so days of continuous use. After that, it doesn't, because your liver gets ramped up so much it breaks it down before too much can get into the bloodstream. That's why you should not take it continuously for any more than 6 days at a time, and you need a six-day break after that. But its activity is shown against herpes viruses, cytomegalovirus, Epstein-Barr in that category, hepatitis B and C, also against human papilloma infected cells. Now, for cytomegalovirus, there is actually human data that shows that artemisinin derivative actually reduced cytomegalovirus loads in a clinical trial. And as you can see, its activity against viruses is extensive, both viruses with and without envelopes, and both RNA and DNA viruses, although the best evidence is for DNA viruses, but you can see it has been studied in terms of single-stranded RNA viruses with envelope against the Flaviviridae and been shown to have strong activity. Licorice. Now, this is again a good example of in vitro research. So the in vitro research started off by showing whole activity for antiviral activity for glycyrrhizin, the whole molecule that's found in licorice. And so I discounted all that research because in vitro non veritas, because I know that when you take licorice orally, glycyrrhizin doesn't get into your bloodstream. It's the aglycone part, which is, if you look at that illustration A there, it's the part to the right. You see that 5 ring structure to the right. That's the part that gets absorbed. The 2 ring structures you see to the left, they're the sugars, and they get taken by the gut flora, and the aglycone gets into the bloodstream. So I thought, it's not clinically antiviral. But then later research showed the aglycone was active, and also the aglycone gets conjugated And those conjugated forms are also active, like glycyrrhizin itself, because they resemble glycyrrhizin, because often glucuronic acid is added back in phase 1, phase 2 conjugation by the liver. It's active in both naked and envelope viruses. And one example, against herpes simplex virus, and another against influenza A virus was seen in animal models. So it is clinically relevant as an antiviral activity. And don't forget, after astragalus, it was number 2 in those traditional Chinese preparations for preventing respiratory infections. St. John's wort contains hypericin and pseudohypericin, and they both have shown significant antiviral activity in vitro, and hypericin was originally researched as an agent for HIV infection. It didn't have enough activity against HIV. HIV is very elusive, it's hard to access as well, but also part of the problem is they were giving pure hypericin, which has very low bioavailability in the pure form, but when you have it in the herb, it's quite bioavailable. There were a couple of randomized controlled trials in recurrent genital and orofacial herpes, and dose was 900 milligrams a day of a dried extract. That's about 5 grams of St. John's wort a day, and they doubled that during skin outbreaks. And in both studies, the St. John's wort clearly reduced the symptom score versus placebo. So clinically demonstrated antiviral activity. Another compound that's getting attention as an antiviral phytochemical is curcumin. And here it is relevant as long as you're using a preparation of curcumin that has enhanced bioavailability, because it's based largely on in vitro studies. A broad-based antiviral activity against extensive in vitro research on its antiviral activity against HIV. Also influenza A, hepatitis B, human norovirus, but it's all in vitro. But in terms of in vivo, the one study did show activity against influenza A, and the lung influenza A virus titer went down and strongly suggesting an antiviral activity. This is a diagram from a review of the antiviral activity of curcumin against the HIV. And as you can see, it's active against HIV at a number of points, at entry, at reverse transcriptase, integrase, it blocks transcription, and it blocks proteases. And that's particularly important, blocking those proteases for broad spectrum antiviral activity against respiratory viruses. And the beauty of curcumin is it's both antiviral and anti-inflammatory. So it's a perfect answer for any concerns about cytokine storm, because it's addressing both those issues, the source of the cytokine storm and the response of the cytokine storm. So let's finish off now by looking at some brief protocols, some of these stepwise, simple protocols. And let's start with supporting general immune health. So you can use either echinacea or antigraphis combined with holy basil and some echinacea if you like, twice a day. I would tend to give decent dose twice a day for prevention, and that's core. I personally and with my patients recommend echinacea. I like personally to reserve antigraphis more for when the infection actually happens. Also, these days, with a greater viral threat, if you feel that's happening, you can use an antiviral formula. Thuja is one herb I haven't mentioned, but it has clinically relevant antiviral activity, I believe, as well. But certainly St. John's wort and licorice, and you can throw in some bioavailable curcumin if you like there as well. Now, if we're talking about respiratory viruses, most of them enter via the throat. So having a liquid herbal throat spray and applying that regularly will help prevention. You can also gargle. You can gargle, as I mentioned, with tea, black tea. You can also gargle. Myrrh is one of my favorites. I've even had patients gargling with echinacea root liquid, and that's very heroic, and I've done it myself, but my goodness, it has a wonderful effect. And if the person needs extra support, if their defenses are down further, if their immunity is more depleted, then you can move in with your tonic adaptogens. And we particularly have seen that astragalus and eleutherococcus have a role here, and there's a combination you can see there, for example, with echinacea that would be of value. Now, this is probably one of the most critical aspects of preventing infections with herbs and via supporting immunity. And again, it's come out of my personal experience, that of some of my students in the early days, and my observation with patients. And that is, if you dose echinacea really, really high, then you can ward off an infection. So the minute you think, I'm really being challenged here, or you've come into contact with a person, who you think might have some increased risk that they've passed on to you, if you feel that's happening temporarily for up to 3 days, double or triple the preventative dose that you're taking, either the echinacea or the antigraphis. Now, if you start getting into very high doses of antigraphis, you increase your risk of a rare anaphylactic allergic reaction to the antigraphis. So watch for that. And it's that allergic risk is one reason why I prefer to give antigraphis more after the fact rather than preventatively. And it has, to me, the best evidence for take it once you're unwell anyway. Now, as I mentioned, your capacity to deal with stress and your resilience is so important here. So if you need to also support adrenal health and your capacity to deal with stress at these times of challenge, then licorice and romani are great as adrenal tonics, and rhodiola and schisandra are wonderful adaptogenic options, together, of course, with the astragalus and eleutherol. Now, I wish I had another hour to talk to you about this, but part of our capacity to deal with infection depends on the health of our endothelium, the lining of our circulatory vessels. And the microcirculation diet, which you can see there with berries, cocoa, garlic, beets, green tea as the core components, and other ones you can introduce if hypertension is present as well, is absolutely critical, I believe, part of having healthy immune barriers and healthy immune responses. So it's an extra thing that people can do via their diet to heighten their defenses and their immune responses. And indeed, it's quite interesting, because if you look across the board, and this has been known for decades, of people at most risk of suffering badly from infections, including respiratory infections, they're people who have pre-existing conditions relating to things like diabetes or cardiovascular or renal, and the microcirculation diet addresses all of those. Now, Beres in her presentation is going to take this much further. So let's finish off now by looking at what happens if a person actually succumbs to a respiratory challenge and they're unwell. So this is when that Andrographis echinacea holy basil combination comes into its own, and I strongly recommend this. I hope I haven't made you overly concerned about an allergic reaction. I want to stress it's very rare. I haven't seen it. I've been using Andrographis clinically now for 25 years. I have not seen one case in my practice, so don't worry about that. But so this is where you must start using Andrographis. And with some echinacea and the holy basil, even better. Holy basil, is the #1 herb in India for once you get, a problem with the respiratory tract, a pathogenic problem with the respiratory tract. You increase the dose, double the dose of an antiviral approach. A St. John's wort, licorice suya combination can be used there. Also bioavailable curcumin as well at higher doses. I really love myrrh as an additional support for the immune system. I apologise we haven't had time to elaborate more on that, but its role there is additional immune support. And for extra antiviral activity, you can look at the Artemisia annua, again taken in higher doses, but only for up to 7 days, and then have a 7-day break to down-regulate those hepatic enzymes that are going to break it down, and then you can repeat if necessary. Other herbs to consider for the respiratory challenges are garlic and golden seal are excellent, and particularly a lung formula which has, pleurisy root, which is a wonderful diaphoretic, to control fever, and also expectorant herbs that will help clear, any threats out of the lungs. The white horehound, thyme, and the ginger supports the diaphoretic action of the pleurisy root and also the expectorant herbs. So that's a wonderful combination. The licorice also has antiviral activity and expectorant activity, as discussed. And don't forget, diaphoretics are really important. And I mentioned pleurisy root, but taken hot, the diaphoretics as herbal teas, peppermint, chamomile, or yarrow, first two are readily available for patients. I recommend that they have them regularly if they have a temperature. If you have a temperature, you must recommend diaphoretic herbs. And the simplest way to do that is go and get some peppermint and chamomile tea bags, one of each, in there, brew it up strong, squeeze the tea bag, throw in a bit of honey, drink it hot. So more things, more issues. Again, you might want to look at gargle or herbal throat spray to help soothe the throat and restore health there. Again, adrenal support, because these sort of challenges can be very taxing on your stress responses. And I've already mentioned it says turmeric, but the bioavailable curcumin is really what I'm talking about. To support a healthy inflammation response during infection, with the bonus of some antiviral activity. And finally, where the lungs are involved, don't forget we have 2 specific formulations that you can use. One, you see the first one has the advantage of the pleurisy root, but where the situation becomes more chronic or subacute, you can emphasize more on the second formula with the Euphorbia grandelia, and the fennel, more the diaphoretic and bronchodilating effects, and that will help with cough and things like that. But demulcent herbs like marshmallow root glycetract, for example, can also help there just by a soothing effect to help with cough. Plus, of course, you've got to keep up all the immune support and everything else that's detailed above. So thank you, and I'd like to mention thanks to Billy O'Connor and her team for assisting with this presentation. And we will now move from the pre-recorded part of this presentation to the live presentation for questions.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's morning here, so we're now going to the live Q&A session. And thank you for all your questions, and especially for the ones on echinacea. So I'm going to go through them in the order that they have come in, and many, as I said, on echinacea. So let's start with the first one. With echinacea, can you take this constantly for months or years? I certainly believe you can, and I think we need to shift our thinking about echinacea in this context, away from it all being a stimulant to the immune system, as I've already discussed, and that it has almost, or probably likely, especially from the longevity study in the mice, an adaptogenic activity. Now, we know we can take adaptogens continuously, and even from the Russian research, adaptogens worked best over time. So I personally do take it continuously. There's nothing wrong with having the odd break here and there. And again, the Russian thinking about adaptogens was that you should, say, break 1 week every month. But look, if you're under threat from pathogens, or you're stressed or in contact with people who might be spreading pathogens to you, you can't really stop, can you? So continuously is no problem, but at times when you feel you don't need it, most certainly stop. Because I have a fairly highly stressful regime, and given my age, I tend to take it every day these days and have for the past few years. If you have an allergy to the daisy family, why can you not use it? Okay, so the problem there is that's more of a pollen allergy, and generally if you're using a root preparation of echinacea, which we have, there's not going to be any pollen there at all. Also, the extraction process for MediHerb is a high alcohol extraction process for the echinacea. So again, any large proteins like pollens will be either denatured or even excluded during the extraction process. So in my view, and I've never seen it, there is absolutely no risk of allergy to echinacea root if you are allergic to the daisy family. Now, there may be other phytochemicals in echinacea that a person is allergic to, but that is incredibly rare. I haven't seen a case in my 35 years of clinical practice, although some colleagues have. So when you're using echinacea root, that's a highly lipophilic extract, in other words, extracted with high alcohol, there's no risk of allergy. Do the cannabinoids in echinacea have any immune benefit? Yes, they certainly do. It's subtle and it's complex and it's not fully understood, but I believe it's the echinacea phytocannabinoids, in other words, the alkylamines, hitting those cannabinoid 2 receptors, which are mainly on immune cells, is a very important part of the immune benefit of echinacea. And it's actually immune modulating because they can, under certain circumstances, as I mentioned, be anti-inflammatory. So we have now this crazy situation of people saying, as discussed, oh, don't take echinacea because it ramps up your cytokine responses and you'll get cytokine storm. But now the French authorities, this actually came from the French government, the French government have come out and warned against taking echinacea preparations rich in alkylamides because they're anti-inflammatory, and get this, they might actually impair the immune response against viruses. This is the crazy nonsense that is now flying around the world. And to come from a government authority, it beggars belief. Yeah, I'm gobsmacked by it. What about the eclectics? What about all of the traditional use? What about all the experience of so many doctors about how it improves immune function? Oh, no. We have a few test tube experiments that show that alkylamides are anti-inflammatory, so whatever you do, don't give them during an infection. It's absolutely crazy. Does echinacea have a drug-drug or herb-drug interaction with warfarin? The answer is no. This was actually tested. There was a slight, in humans, there was a slight shift in warfarin levels, but it was considered to be not clinically relevant. Why is astragalus contraindicated in acute infections and better for chronic? We're basing this on the traditional Chinese thinking, but it also relates to me about the best use of a herb. So contraindication might be a strong term. Perhaps we could say best practice. And I do want to stress that in traditional Chinese medicine, they do use astragalus during acute infections, but it's in a combination with other modulating herbs in there, and it's done according to TCM principles. So if you're a Western herbalist and not really tuned into these complexities and subtleties, I think the best thing to say is that astragalus is not so much contraindicated in acute infections, but best used for chronic, to build immunity, for chronic viruses, for immune depletion. That's a strength, and we need to play to our strengths. In an acute infection, you have much better options. So yes, absolutely, stop the astragalus and switch to antigraphis. I often say to my patients, I'm really sorry, but they have similar names, but I want to take this one, astragalus, to keep you well, but if you get ill, I want you to switch to this one, antigraphis, to help you control the infection. It's coming out that the current virus may not be an acute respiratory distress problem, but instead a heme issue, more like high altitude tissue starvation problem. In other words, altitude sickness. Have I heard this? Absolutely, and I believe that first responders in New York City are saying they've seen extraordinary things with people with oxygen saturations at 60 and 70%. They've never seen that before. They're amazed that the person is even alive. And what would you do? Well, if so, would these protocols still translate? Absolutely, because the problem is still being caused by a virus and an infection, and the immune system needs to respond appropriately, and we need to modulate cytokines with diaphoretic herbs. So absolutely, these protocols still apply. And don't forget, I mentioned
they don't have the right to object.
Protocol.
That is
now,
the rule,
that's part of how
and that
you
is
address this, by improving tissue perfusion. There are also 3 key herbs involved there, and they are ginkgo, gotukola, and grapeseed, because they support the microcirculation. Now, they come in combination, but if you're using that and there's altitude sickness, for example, you want to probably give extra ginkgo. So the microcirculation protocol, extra ginkgo, and that grapeseed, gotukola, ginkgo combination will address this. So it's kind of, by my mentioning the microcirculation protocol, inbuilt in the strategies, and it explains, as Paris will address in her presentation, the reason why people with high degrees of cardiovascular problems are particularly at risk. Is liquid echinacea more effective than in the tablet form? No, we've actually done a clinical study. If you're talking about our products, absolutely no. We've actually done a clinical study, a pharmacokinetic study, looking at alkylamide levels in the bloodstream, and the areas under the curve, which represent the total exposure of the body to the alkylamides after the oral dosing, is no different, not significantly different between our tablets and our liquid. So you can use either. There is an advantage in using the liquid if the patient can tolerate it, and that is you get the local effect in the mouth and on the throat. Now, as we know, viruses often get entry via the throat and nasal mucous membranes. So if you're getting an effect on the throat, and this is why we're advocating the gargles, it's all about barriers. If you're getting a local effect of echinacea on the throat, I'm sure that improves the immune response at those barriers. Is there a study with long-term echinacea? Yes, it's me. I joke, it's an N of 1 study. So I've been taking echinacea long-term for just over, well, I think probably just over 25 years. As you can see, it's done me a great deal of harm. Not. So, no, we haven't those studies, and we probably need them. But the whole point is that the concerns are based on misinformation. So if we were to do studies that address the constant and indeed contradictory, as you're now seeing with that example from the French government, misinformation about echinacea, you'd be doing nothing else. And it really is a pointless exercise. How do I test the immune system to evaluate the patient? Basically, I do it from their history. But here's something I will say. Here's something that's been highlighted by the country, by the current situation, and that is that in this day and age, supporting immunity is a necessity. Don't necessarily need to say, oh, you're prone to colds and flus. Hey, I'm going to support your immune system. I think it's a necessity, and certainly, as you have heard from my taking echinacea every day, is something that I've subscribed to for decades. But on the other hand, if you want to focus, then do look at the person's capacity to get over infection, their frequency of getting infections, and indeed if they have other problems that you can ascribe to an imbalance in the immune system, such as, for an example, an autoimmune disease. Can astragalus be used during chemotherapy in patients to raise white blood cell count? Absolutely it can, and absolutely I do that in conjunction with ashwagandha. So that astragalus-ashwagandha combination I often use there. Which of the herbs discussed are safe for breastfeeding mothers? Generally, the Artemisia annua I would not do. Everything else that I can recall is good. But what I would do, and I think this is important, these days we're I guess so used to accessing information online, and it's fine to do that. But if you're going to do that, please refer to our catalogue information, because we have people who scour the literature on a regular basis to put in all the safety data for our products, and it's there. And to be honest, I don't have it all in my head. I refer to it, but I'm fairly certain there's no problem with anything that we've currently recommended except for the Artemisia annua. Are there any contraindications for taking echinacea? Yes, there is one, and that's someone who's had organ transplant and is on immunosuppressive medication. Now, this is particularly critical in the first 12 months after the transplant, but after that, things tend to stabilize and rejection risk is lower. And generally in that first 12 months, I tend to avoid all immune enhancing or supporting herbs or modulating herbs. What I then will do and have done safely after that first 12 months after organ transplant is give herbs like echinacea short term. can I recommend a resource to understand the different viruses, RNA, DNA, enveloped, etc.? No, I'm sorry, not off the top of my head. I can't recommend that. But often what I do in these circumstances is I go to PubMed and I put in an appropriate number of searches, and then I click on the review option. Or you could just try and Google primer about, virology primer. I would suggest probably a virology textbook would do it, but I don't have one on the top of my head. I've kind of gleaned what I know from basically you going to the direct source of the literature. Most of the work I do is primary literature research. One of my thoughts about putting echinacea liquid on the skin, absolutely. The eclectics used echinacea topically for many, many different skin problems. It's probably an underestimated aspect of its usage. Can you repeat why Artemisia shouldn't be used for more than 6 days? So you shouldn't use it for just digestive health long term, i.e. as a bitter. Also, I've read that Artemisia may reduce iron. Okay, so there's a few sort of things rolled in here together. The first is we need to be careful about which Artemisia we are talking about. So the Artemisia we shouldn't use for more than 6 days is Artemisia annua, the sweet wormwood. It's from Chinese medicine. It contains artemisinin, a very active phytochemical. And that phytochemical is so active that it stimulates a high degree of metabolism by the liver. So after 6 days of taking Artemisia annua, because your liver becomes so active at metabolizing the artemisinin, there is none left in your bloodstream. None. So naturally you have to break then for about 6 days, let those liver enzymes that have been induced come back to normal, and so you can dose again. Because if you keep taking it after 6 days, it's useless if you're relying on the artemisinin. Now that contrasts with the Western wormwood, Artemisia absinthium, and that is the species that we use as a bitter. That species is entirely safe to take long-term as a bitter for digestive health. And we have that in combination with gentian and feverfew and so on as a digestive formula. Quite okay. Whereas Artemisia annua, we're highlighting the artemisinin aspect of it in the product. I've also read that Artemisia may reduce iron. That's a strange thing to read because, and maybe you're perhaps a bit confused, because Artemisia absinthium, the bitter, by improving gastric acid will help iron absorption. So Artemisia absinthium wormwood will improve iron absorption. Artemisia annua works with iron. The artemisinin in the Chinese or sweet wormwood works with iron to kill parasites. So the iron is actually a cofactor involved in that. So there's probably just some ideas there that have got conflated. More questions. Bupleurum and Paeonia occur several times in TCM protocols. With the exception of the intense cytokine storm progression, where patients will need a hospitalization, herbs like Rehmannia, Hemidesmus and Bupleurum would be seen to be a potential candidate for priming during the second phase of acute viral infections marked by the potential risk of cytokine storm. Could I comment on this? So, as I illustrated with the example of the French French government advice on, don't take anti-inflammatory herbs during a viral infection. This is kind of an issue for which we have no definitive knowledge. There is a suggestion, of course, that anti-inflammatory and immune modulating herbs like Rehmannia, Hemidesmus, and Buplurum would be quite useful during a cytokine storm. But it is somewhat, and the reason being that they're not too powerful like the drugs that might be used, and therefore you're not necessarily going to get, an undesirable effect of ramping down the immune response too low, and the virus gets a free rein. So they would potentially be a better, if you like, anti-inflammatory option during cytokine storm, if it proves that anti-inflammatories during cytokine storm are beneficial. That was why I was talking about the bioavailable curcumin, because my view is that if you're going to give something that is somewhat anti-inflammatory in the cytokine storm phase, then you're better at least to give something like with the curcumin that has an activity that's antiviral as well. So you're kind of hedging both bets. But all of this is somewhat theoretical, I believe, because someone who's suffering a cytokine storm is probably in intensive care on a respirator. So who's going to come in with a herbal tablet and say, here, take this? So you would have to really catch it in those very early stages. So we're talking here about the current issue with infection on possibly days 8 to 10, because it's usually by the 10th day that cytokine storm tends to develop. So Korean ginseng is used in Chinese hospital protocols for the current problem throughout the pneumonia phase, and it's been said in the past by people like me that you can't use Korean ginseng like astragalus in acute settings. So can I comment on that? Well, the answer is, and this applies to the answer I gave about astragalus, and that is that they're used in formulation by people who are skilled with Chinese medicine precepts. And for us, applying from a Western herbal perspective, it's best to not necessarily use either ginseng or astragalus. They have better uses elsewhere than during that acute phase. Should we discontinue antigraphis if a patient progresses towards cytokine storm? It's debatable. Probably. Now you have a handout that's available in conjunction with the seminar notes, and that handout discusses the ins and outs of cytokine storm in the context of herbs. And there is in there some quotes from Ellingwood. Now the reality is that the eclectic herbalists like Ellingwood used echinacea for cytokine storm. In fact, they use the term sepsis, but sepsis equals cytokine storm. So they recognized it then, way back then, 100 plus years ago. And Ellingwood goes so far as to say that echinacea is the herb for sepsis. So I would say if you're getting to day 7, day 8 with a patient in the current scenario, and they appear to be deteriorating, and they have been taking antigraphis, I would suggest that maybe that's a time to switch over perhaps to a wholly echinacea product at relatively high doses, and the kind of doses that you use are described in our protocols and indeed in those quotes from Ellingwood. Chinese skullcap is thought to confer some protection on ACE2 receptors. Could you use the Western skullcap as well in that context, Scutellaria lateriflora? Well, the answer here is it comes back to in vitro non veritas. A lot of that work is fairly speculative. ACE2 receptors, don't forget, are on the surfaces of cells. So if you really perhaps wanted to get an effect from the Chinese skullcap, you might have to inhale it or something like that. So we have to be careful about extrapolating test tube research to real situations. So I think that research about Chinese skullcap and ACE2 receptors is fairly speculative, in vitro non veritas, and I wouldn't use it to guide my clinical decisions. And I must say, as I've mentioned in my talk, what is really concerning me in the current scenario, there are people out there touting indications and contraindications very strongly and definitively. I've given you examples with the French government about indications and contraindications for particular herbs in the current scenario, and it's purely based on test tube research. This should not be guiding our clinical decisions in these circumstances. So, moving on to the second lot of questions. I think I might have to truncate my answers. I've only got a few more minutes left. Does ginkgo have any antiviral or immune-related benefits? Not that I'm aware of. So I never usually go higher than 8 antigraphs a day and never run into an anaphylaxis reaction. Any way we can predict if patients are heading towards an antigraphis allergy? No. Can I compare antigraphis with the Chinese formula containing antigraphis? No, that's beyond my ken. We've had the pregnancy and breastfeeding question already. Again, apart from the Artemisia annua, I'm fairly convinced or fairly safe. Licorice, you don't want to use long-term in pregnancy, but again, please refer to the catalogue information. What's a high dose of echinacea? 10 ml of a 1 and 2, 3 times a day? Yes, that would qualify for a high dose. How many echinacea tablets have I taken in a day personally when I needed to? 16 is the number. That's equivalent to 40 ml a day. So yeah, you're getting up there. I tended a similar you gave a few years ago. You talked about taking 8 echinacea tablets yourself as a preventative herb when I travelled by plane for the US. Can I make a suggestion for getting on a plane over the next few months in light of COVID-19? I would do a similar thing. I would refer you to all of the protocols. Don't forget the throat spray in those circumstances. Barriers are incredibly important here, and the throat spray will help protect at least one of the barriers. Another question about pregnancy and contraindications. Again, please refer to the catalogue. Myrrh might be perhaps a contraindication as well. Why should myrrh be only taken for 6 days? Because of the risk of allergy in this context. That's why I break up myrrh. You could probably just break for a couple of days if you're using it in an acute scenario and then start it again for 6 days. Is there a role for red clover in respiratory infection? Not in my world. Or Korean ginseng? Yes, in chronic respiratory infections, there are trials of Korean ginseng in COPD and those sorts of scenarios. Can I speak of the use of these herbs in autoimmune disease? They are all fine. in my experience, and I use them all. And MediHerb products, are they gluten-free? Absolutely they are, and indeed they are tested. Are these protocols appropriate for the current virus prophylaxis? Yes, they are. What about for infection? I refer to, again, the protocols that I gave you there for infection. Any herbs to target increasing oxygen uptake? Already discussed. Microcirculation protocol, ginkgo, and so on. Is myrrh the same as guggul used in Ayurveda? No, they are not. They are completely different. Don't confuse the two. ACE2 and issues with the virus using the enzyme to go into the cell. I don't think there's anything we can definitively say there other than improve your barriers, clean your barriers with things like a throat spray. I didn't discuss thymus support. Is that critical in viral infections? Yes, it is, but we don't know herbs that do that. It's important for general immune infections, and I'm sure you have other options to address that. Well, we just made those questions in the time limit involved. So thank you very much for attending this, and thank you for your strong interest and your questions. I hope that I have been able to answer them to your satisfaction. So please join us for the next masterclass with Beres, because you will continue to get some very useful and highly relevant information and a further exploration of some of the questions that have been asked already.